Hey, I'm Todd Jones. I'm the host of the podcast, Press Box Access.
Here's a clip from my interview with Mike DeCourcy. Let's hear what he learned from covering Penn State and its iconic coach, Joe Paterno.
Joe was the most difficult person I've encountered in 43 years of doing this now.
All right, let's talk about Joe Paterno. He's the most difficult person you encountered in 40 years of doing this. Why?
Because it was interesting because the narrative about Penn State football and Joe Paterno when I took over the beat in 1984 was that he did everything right and everything was wonderful and everything was great and nobody ever had a problem and it was all grand and he was St. Joe and there were a lot of national media people, accomplished national media people who perpetuated that and so I went up there thinking that, and then as with each passing year he tried to make my job more difficult. And he didn't treat me with much respect. I was young, and I get that, but I was trying to do a good job, and with a little bit of guidance. I mean, and I think a coach has to interact in a way that offers guidance. If you want your team to be covered a certain way, then you have to respond in that certain way. You have to interact with the people who cover you in a way that promotes that. And
what did Paterno do? What did he do?
Basically, it was just keep closing doors. It started with when they closed their practices off. The practices were closed well before. It's standard practice now, and it's unfortunate. But back then, he was among the pioneers in that, and not telling the truth about injuries and that sort of thing. When I started doing it, I used to go up on Thursday before a Saturday game for home games. And the locker room would be open to reporters on Thursday afternoon after practice. Mm-hmm. And I was the only one who took advantage of it. And after, I think, 2 years, maybe 3 tops, he said, he said basically, well, that's it. We're not doing this anymore. And then they would bring players out to a player lounge or whatever for me to interview.
Right.
And that was less productive, but you had to live with it. And then after that, that shut down. And you can only talk to players on a conference call. And honestly, I got to know some really bright, engaging young people by doing the interviews in the locker room, or even to a lesser extent in the interview area. But by the time my last team that I covered, I didn't know a single player on the team. Because I didn't get any chance to do it. And I remember Ken Denlinger followed that team. It had like an inside the program kind of deal with Joe, and he did a book on it. And I remember reading the book and thinking, I finally got to meet all these guys that I was covered and didn't know. He was hostile to the media in a lot of ways, except when it was a big national and they would come to town and do an article on him. And it bothered me while I did it, and it bothered me for years afterward that he was that difficult to deal with. But I look back maybe 15, 20 years later, and I realized it was the best education I could have ever gotten, because it made me realize, don't just accept what's on the surface. Don't accept what everybody is saying about somebody. Find out for yourself, is this really the person that they say it is? Is this really the program that they say it is? That's what I learned from covering Joe and Penn State football. And I really believe that it made me a much better journalist having gone through that.
Yeah, make a call, develop sources, get other people. You don't need to get it just from Oz himself.
Yeah, and as well as just that, it's funny, like I mentioned about the national narrative about Joe, and that persisted during my time there. They still had I covered a national championship team in 1986. I covered one that played for it in 1985, so they still had very successful teams in that period. So they still had national people come in, and then they would go back and write a similar, I shouldn't say the same, but a similar glowing article about who he was. And I would always be sitting there, I talk to myself a lot because I work at home, and I'd say out loud, like, talk to me. I'll tell you. It's not that. That's not what it is. This is not how this program is. It may not be necessarily bad, but it's not this. And no one, of course, ever did talk to the local reporter about that. But I covered them for 9 years. I never had a one-on-one with Joe for all the
Really?
times.
9 years, never had a one-on-one.
No, I remember one time, I think it was around the time they played for it the first time, we were going to do a big feature on it. We called it our page 3 in the Pittsburgh Press. And so I wanted a one-on-one, and I got a 4-on-1 with 3 other reporters. Can't remember who they were, but I could get a one-on-one with Jerry Faust or Lou Holtz when Penn State would play Notre Dame, and we'd co-cover that game. I could get that, but I couldn't get it with Joe.
Wow. Mike, when years later, when the scandal hit with Jerry Sandusky and it all fell apart there and Paterno was fired at the age of 85, what did you think then, looking back based on your own experiences?
Yeah, what I wrote before he passed, but upon the dissolution of the Paterno program, was that I believe that the secrecy of the program contributed to what not to necessarily what developed, but to how it was all handled. That secrecy was held as sort of a sacrament in Penn State football program over the course of that time. And I think it ended up being, again, I'm not asserting that Joe knew anything or anything like that, but I do know that once it was on his desk, he could have been a hero. He could have said, "This is horrible. We got to stop this. And that didn't happen. It could have happened immediately, and that's not because he was the most powerful figure in the state. And if he'd have said, this is horrendous, and we've got to do something about this. If he'd have gone to his bosses at Penn State and said, this happened, it's bad, but we have to put a stop to this, and we have to make sure that we get out in front of it. I think he could have been a hero of sorts, and he did not choose that course, and Penn State did not choose that course in that circumstance.